Thanks, Todd. I do want to say, and a special thanks to CSBA and to Todd in particular for putting this herd of cats together. And I look forward to see how my colleagues or the other teams solve these very challenging problems. I've got 7 slides to get through and 10 minutes to do it, so this is going to go as fast as I possibly can. And you will see that I've been doing or following quadrennial defense reviews way too long, so many of the tropes of past QDRs are going to have slipped into the presentation. They're going to be silly headlines like, at least you notice win is absent from the headline, and there are some sort of Kabbalistic numerical formula that we'll refer to just for you. They're QDR jokes for you QDR veterans. I also want to say thanks to my teammates, Mackenzie Eaglin and Phil Lowhouse. We've really expanded our defense work at AEI over the last couple of years since we planted the flag of the Maryland War Center. It's a delight to have both of them work with me now in Mackenzie's case for about 18 months. So if there's a problem with the presentation, it's their fault and not mine. All right, so here we go. We have to start with the bottom line up front. All I can offer you is roads to failure, roads to defeat. The question is, how fast and how straight are they going to be? And one insight I took away from the whole exercise is that even absent any sequestration cuts or a deal that cuts sequestration in half, that the current levels of spending are going to be inadequate to maintain the international system that the United States has built over the last 7 decades. And again, I'm not going to go through them in great detail, but essentially anything less than the minimum force to cover our global commitments will mean systemic failure in our judgment. But to play the game, this is how we tried to sort of spread the butter across the toast, so to speak. And the question is, again, how fast and how soon are we going to get to failure? Which meant, particularly for us, that we thought near-term risk was the essential hurdle, the first hurdle to get over. If we don't have a peaceful world in 5 years, it won't matter what's on the drawing boards or in the pipeline. So, also, apropos of the guidance, we got to, even though we used the President's guidance as the jumping off point, we went back to the essential goals of the QDR independent panel, which Mackenzie and I both did clerical work for a couple of years ago, but it is an outstanding bipartisan sort of definition of what the United States has done, the way we've behaved over the past decades, and the components of the broad great power peace that we now enjoy. So this is what we're trying to preserve. This is our definition of victory. And this is how we're going to try to get there. At least in the current environment, 2 things are important. We have to deter China from upsetting the balance of power in East Asia and elsewhere, and we have to reverse the withdrawal that's now underway in the Middle East. In my judgment, that withdrawal is something like, and could even be worse than, the American withdrawal from Europe after 1918. We're going to pay for that again. And the sooner we get back to it, the cheaper it'll be. And that ought to be the first goal of defense planning. How are we going to cover the bets? Well, we're not going to do things in the old joint way. We've got to take a lot of risk. Essentially, our goal was to put the sea services, give them responsibility for the Pacific, patrolling the Pacific, give the Army the responsibility for reclaiming our position in the greater Middle East, and if anything got out of hand, we'd have a big Air Force to bomb people with. That's what we had as a backup. Not very much depth, but a little bit more breadth. And we also took the requirement to rebuild our nuclear forces in a multilateral nuclear environment as something that required investment. But this is a tripwire, and nothing more than that. And I'll quickly go through the particulars. So both sea services need to be, again, the idea is they only go to the Pacific except in extremis. So we have to shrink them, but modernize them. I do not want carriers with 4th-generation fighters on them. These airplanes have been fabulous airplanes for a long time, but they can't survive in the emerging environment. So we want to get to the next generation as fast as we could do. And it's just a question of how much money you have to spend. I won't go through the particulars in detail. Please feel free to ask questions about them. And I'm sure Todd will put out the particulars, the spreadsheets, and go through some of the differences and commonalities. Likewise, it's the Army that's got to cover the greater Middle East, that part of the planet that's constantly in turmoil, from West Africa to beyond the Persian Gulf. We tried to preserve Army end strength at the cost of modernization. Not that there's very much modernization in the Army to worry about either way. And to retain a heavy core so that if we did need to mobilize for a large-scale contested operation, there was at least a nucleus to mobilize around. And we took away from special operations forces. Less global manhunt. We also killed the Predator orbits by 2/3, disbanded MARSOC, and as you see, cut the direct action force significantly. And that didn't change regardless of how much money we had to play with. So the one ace we have in reserve under our strategy is air power and nuclear forces. I don't think that what we came up with is really what I would call an adequately sized Air Force. And just because of where we are today, it's impossible to get to much in the way of new capabilities. We threw every dollar that we could at a new bomber, but we thought it was important to modernize the fighter fleet. That's all the mass we're ever going to have in terms of firepower. One thing that we did add is intermediate range ballistic missiles to the land forces, to the Army. Since everybody else is threatening us and our allies with missiles, we thought it'd be fair game to turn the tables and not rely entirely on manned aircraft or unmanned aircraft, but if ballistic missiles are the cheap man's long-range firepower, we could use some of that too. And as I said earlier, we thought it was essential to reinvest in a nuclear deterrent. We're no longer in a bipolar, well-defined deterrence regime. There are just many more players in the game, and their goals are much different. If you start looking at the social science of deterrence and start thinking about the modern world, it'll just give you a giant headache. The one thing that we could be sure of is that where we're headed is the wrong direction. Finally, if anything larger than we can control with our patrolling forces were to occur, we're going to be in deep kimchi. There are a lot of scenarios. I can't handicap them, but they're not unrealistic. I didn't make these up. We didn't make these up. Whether it's a North Korea collapse, China decides to snatch something, we decide we can't live with the mullahs in Iran any longer, we get the coin disease again, you name it. Anything that we want to do besides keep the lid on the world is going to be hard to do, and it's going to take a long time to mobilize forces to get there, particularly if you're talking about a reserve call-up. Industrial mobilization, making more things, would even be a greater struggle and take longer. We'd have to throw a lot of money at it. And the question of Allied participation, I think, is a much more open question. Our allies read us. When they see us withdrawing from the world, they're not going to stick their necks out any farther than we're willing to do so. So I think we have to think that, rethink that. And we had some options in the game, say, to transfer F-35 to partner countries. We think that's an excellent idea. And in particularly, I would be very worried. We're going to go into a very much home-based CONUS posture. So getting to where we're going to have to fight and where we would prefer to fight, and in particularly going the last 10 or 15% is going to be very difficult to do and a very risky tactical, operational, and even strategic and political calculation. And I think the final takeaway is we're doing this to ourselves. The amount of funding that we're talking about is not going to affect our national debt, the annual deficit, the fiscal condition of the government, growth of our economy, in the size of the American economy, we're talking about chump change. But in the effect in the world, which I think is the ultimate measure, the ultimate metric of strategy and defense planning, we're taking huge risks, and we don't have to. I look at the Middle East, I don't see a tide of war that's receding. I see a tide of American power that's receding. I don't know whether China is deterred or not. I'm not talking about containing China. I'm talking strictly about a military strategy of deterrence, preventing the Chinese from upsetting the current order by the use of military force in a preemptive way, or coercing and intimidating states who are our friends and are our allies. This is a system that's produced unprecedented, historically unprecedented peace, prosperity, and liberty, and it faces a single point of failure kind of collapse. I think that's a very bad idea. I'm glad we played this game because it showed us what the costs would be of further cuts and how cheap it would be to avoid the geopolitical costs of the cuts. But other than that, I hated every minute of it. I look forward to your questions and to the others' presentations. Thanks for putting up with it.